My father stood in a Boston courtroom, looked at the judge, and declared, "She is not my biological daughter." Everyone thought I just lost my inheritance and 39 years as a Baldwin. They did not know the briefcase at my feet held a file heavy enough to crush a will, a corporate takeover, and a marriage built on lies. The DNA results did not just answer "Who am I?" They revealed who would pay the ultimate price. My name is Serena Baldwin. I am 39 years old. I sat in the high-backed leather chair of courtroom number 4 in downtown Boston, perfectly still. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone, but the room felt completely devoid of oxygen. The mahogany walls seemed to close in around the packed gallery. The smell of lemon floor wax mixed with the sharp scent of expensive wool suits and nervous sweat. Everyone in the room held their breath. At the witness stand sat Malcolm Baldwin. He was the legendary founder of Baldwin Meridian Systems. He was a titan of the American energy infrastructure industry. He was the man who built power grids and designed survival systems for entire coastal cities. He was also my father, or, at least, the man who had played that exact role for nearly 4 decades. Malcolm slowly adjusted his silk tie. His hands, usually so steady when reviewing complex engineering blueprints, trembled just a fraction of an inch. He cleared his throat. He looked directly at the presiding judge. He did not look at me. "She is not my biological daughter." The words dropped like heavy iron stones into a stagnant pond. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick. It was heavy with the immediate shock of reporters typing frantically on their phones, board members exchanging panicked glances, and a gallery waiting to tear apart a legacy. The corporate empire we built together was worth over $5 billion. The shares in dispute represented a controlling stake in the company. If those shares moved, the entire foundation of the company moved. This was never just a family tragedy. This was a ruthless corporate takeover disguised as a domestic inheritance dispute. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I did not throw my hands up or shout angry objections at the bench. Such reactions belonged to amateurs, to people who did not see the blade coming in the dark. I had felt the cold edge of this knife pressing against my back for months. I had seen the locked doors, the hushed conversations in the hallways, the sudden shifts in executive schedules. Instead of breaking down, I simply tightened my grip on the edge of the defendant's table. My knuckles turned stark white against the dark, polished wood. The sharp edge dug deep into my skin. It was a grounding pain. It kept me anchored in the physical room while the rest of the world tried to spin me out of existence. Across the center aisle, seated precisely in the middle of the plaintiff's bench, was Vanessa Hale. She was Malcolm's second wife. She sat with an eerie, practiced stillness that chilled the blood. Her posture was flawless, her spine perfectly straight against the chair. Her face was a masterclass in mournful composure. It was suspiciously calm. A normal woman hearing her husband publicly disown his only child in open court should show discomfort. Perhaps a flinch of empathy, or at least genuine surprise. Vanessa only showed the serene, infinite patience of a spider watching a fly exhaust itself in a carefully woven web. Beside her sat her son, Nolan Hale. Nolan was a man who wore his unearned ambition like cheap cologne. He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. His arms were crossed casually over his custom-tailored suit. His face was entirely cold, completely devoid of any feigned sympathy or familial warmth. He looked exactly like a man who had already memorized the final act of this play. He knew the lines. He knew the blocking. He was just waiting for the curtain to fall, so he could collect his applause and the keys to the executive suite on the top floor. The opposing counsel, a sharp-featured and ruthless litigator named Aris Thorne, stepped forward. His polished shoes clicked sharply and rhythmically against the marble floor. He approached the judge's bench holding a thick manila folder. He held it with both hands, presenting it carefully, almost like a holy relic. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice booming and echoing into the high ceilings of the stifling room. We submit into Evidence Exhibit A. This is a preliminary, certified DNA report from an independent, court-approved genetics laboratory. The results are scientifically conclusive. The probability of paternity between Malcolm Baldwin and Serena Baldwin is exactly 0%. There is absolutely no biological relationship whatsoever. Thorne let the brutal statement hang in the air for a long moment. He turned slowly on his heels, letting his gaze sweep over the packed gallery before finally settling his dark, calculating eyes on me. Given this incontrovertible scientific evidence, Thorne continued, his tone turning sharp, clinical, and deadly. We respectfully request that the court immediately dismiss the respondent's standing in this inheritance dispute. We ask the court to strip Serena Baldwin of her status as a legal heir and completely revoke her claim to the controlling shares of Baldwin Meridian Systems. She is a biological stranger to the Baldwin bloodline. Therefore, she has no legal, moral, or ethical right to the estate or the enterprise. A low, chaotic murmur rippled through the gallery. It was the terrifying sound of a $5 billion empire fracturing in real time. The judge, a stern woman with decades of grueling probate experience, held up a single, authoritative hand. The murmurs died instantly, replaced by a suffocating tension. She took the folder from the court bailiff. She opened it. She read the report in agonizingly slow motion. Every single second that ticked by felt like an entire hour. The judge did not rush to judgment. She did not bang her wooden gavel and declare the case closed. She slowly closed the folder, folded her hands together on the desk, and looked down at the floor in deep thought. The court acknowledges the submission of the preliminary DNA report, the judge finally said. Her voice was measured, careful, and totally devoid of emotion. However, given the unprecedented financial scale of the assets involved and the sudden, drastic nature of this claim, I will not issue an immediate summary judgment today. Both sides will be permitted to present their full arguments, call witnesses, and submit all supporting evidence. The court requires the complete picture before dismantling a lifetime of legal precedent. That ruling created a massive, suffocating vacuum in the room. The immediate execution they had planned for me was delayed. The heavy silence returned, heavier and darker than before. Suddenly, every single eye in the courtroom shifted direction. The eager reporters, the calculating lawyers, the icy Vanessa, the arrogant Nolan, and the stoic judge. They all looked at me. They waited for my collapse. They waited for the inevitable tears of a broken, disinherited daughter. I ignored every single one of them. My eyes were locked entirely on Malcolm. He was slowly descending from the witness stand. His steps were slightly uneven, heavily burdened by the weight of his own betrayal. The false bravado he had faked during his devastating declaration was already fading into something that looked dangerously like regret. He walked back to his formidable legal team. But for a fraction of a second, his eyes darted away from his lawyers and moved toward me. He did not look at my face. He did not look at my white-knuckled hands gripping the table. He looked down toward the floor. He looked directly at the floor right beside my chair. He looked at the scuffed, vintage brown leather briefcase resting quietly against my ankle. In that microscopic moment, I saw it. I saw the sudden, involuntary twitch of his left eyelid. I saw the slight, terrified hesitation in his breathing. I saw absolute, unadulterated terror mask his features. He was not afraid of the judge's ruling. He was not afraid of the merciless press waiting outside the heavy wooden doors. He was terrified of that old briefcase. He knew exactly what it meant. He knew the ghost that lived inside those leather walls. The realization hit me with sudden clarity. The confusion of the family drama fell away, leaving only the hard outline of a corporate war. This was never a simple, tragic matter of a father rejecting a daughter. This was not a sudden crisis of conscience or a rigid obsession with bloodlines. Someone had meticulously orchestrated this entire spectacle, whispering poisonous words in his ear, isolating him from his loyal allies, and weaponizing the very concept of DNA. They were using my genetic makeup as a master key to unlock the Baldwin trust, bypass the loyal board, and hand the entire $5 billion infrastructure company to greedy outsiders. They thought they had thoroughly outsmarted me. They thought bringing cold science into the courtroom would be the ultimate, indisputable checkmate. They assumed my lack of Baldwin blood would instantly strip me of my operational power, erase my history of building the company, and silence my voice forever. They were completely disastrously wrong. I slowly relaxed my agonizing grip on the heavy wooden table. The blood rushed back into my numb fingers, bringing a tingling warmth. I lowered my right hand slowly and let it rest firmly on the worn, familiar leather handle of the briefcase. The leather was warm to the touch. It felt exactly like holding the hand of the only person who had ever truly understood the foundation of our family and our business. I took a deep, silent, centering breath. I looked past the broken shell of the man who used to be my father. I looked straight into Vanessa Hale's perfectly composed, calculating eyes. Today, one of two things was going to happen in this suffocating courtroom. Either I was going to be quietly erased from the Baldwin family history forever, swept away like useless dust, or this entire fake, parasitic family was going to explode right here in the middle of the court, leaving nothing but ashes. I tightened my grip on the handle. I was more than ready for the explosion. The leather handle of the briefcase was worn smooth by decades of calloused hands, carrying the exact weight of where we actually came from. Before the glass skyscrapers, before the tailored silk suits, and long before anyone in a courtroom cared about genetics. Baldwin Meridian Systems was nothing but a drafty, oil-stained garage in Cambridge, Boishin. If you walked into that workshop in the early days, you would not see a corporate empire. You would smell burning rosin, cut copper wire, and cheap black coffee. We built survival. We designed backup power systems and microgrid infrastructure for places that could not afford to go dark. When a coastal hurricane ripped the main power lines to shreds, our generators were the only things keeping the lights on in neonatal intensive care units, regional data centers, and emergency storm shelters. My father was the visionary mechanic. He had a magnetic smile and a mind that could untangle the most complex electrical grids. He could walk into a room of skeptical city planners and sell them a massive infrastructure upgrade purely on his passionate belief that our engineering would save lives. He was the face, the voice, and the raw ambition of the operation. But my mother, Evelyn Baldwin, was the spine. While my father was out promising the moon to municipal utility boards, my mother was the one figuring out how to build a rocket on a shoestring budget. She was the architect of our contracts, the master of our legal defenses, and the brilliant strategist who kept the company from collapsing under the crushing weight of early debt. She understood that a brilliant piece of engineering was utterly useless if the commercial terms bankrupted the manufacturer. I did not grow up in country clubs or equestrian centers like the other children of future billionaires. I grew up sitting on wooden shipping pallets in the secondary parts warehouse. My childhood desk was an empty crate that used to hold heavy-duty industrial transformers. I did my middle school algebra homework to the deafening soundtrack of metal grinders and forklift engines. Instead of bedtime stories, I listened to my parents argue in the kitchen over liability insurance premiums, supply chain bottlenecks, union contract negotiations, and how to handle clients who refused to pay their invoices on time. I absorbed the brutal, unglamorous reality of keeping a business alive. My mother never let me believe I was a rich princess waiting for a crown. She made sure I knew the difference between owning a company on paper and actually running it in the mud. A family business does not survive because people share the same last name, she told me once, her sharp eyes peering over a stack of late vendor invoices. It does not live on bloodline. It survives entirely on whoever is willing to stay in the room and work when everything else falls apart. I took those words and carved them into my bones. As a teenager, while my peers were spending their summers at the beach, I was an operations grunt. I rode in the passenger seats of our utility trucks heading into the teeth of coastal storms. I learned how to read a voltmeter before I learned how to drive. I stood in flooded basements with water up to my knees, shining a flashlight while our lead technicians desperately tried to hotwire a failing hospital generator. I learned the harsh, profane language of exhausted line workers. I learned how to calm down terrified hospital administrators when the primary grid failed. I learned how to buy coffee and donuts for the delivery drivers so they would prioritize our copper wire shipments over our competitors. I earned my place in the mud, right alongside the people who actually built the machines. When I finally joined the company full-time after graduating from university, I did not ask for an executive office. I asked for the messiest, most disastrous portfolio we had. We were bleeding cash on a massive municipal contract that was 8 months behind schedule. The previous project manager had completely lost control of the vendors, and the city was threatening to trigger ruinous penalty clauses. I moved into a mobile trailer on the construction site for 6 solid months. I spent 18 hours a day untangling the mess. I fired the lazy suppliers and personally flew across the country to renegotiate contracts with reliable subcontractors. I completely restructured our supply chain, mapping out every single nut, bolt, and battery cell until the logistics flowed like water. I turned a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar loss into a break-even salvage operation, saving the company from a disastrous lawsuit. That was the exact turning point. That was the moment the grizzled foreman, the cynical engineers, and the seasoned department heads stopped looking at me as the boss's privileged daughter. They started looking at me as the person they would follow into a burning building, because they knew I actually understood the work. We were a perfect, unstoppable trio. My father dreamed up the future. My mother secured the foundation, and I executed the operations. We were going to build an infrastructure dynasty that would last a century. Then, my mother's heart began to fail. The decline was agonizingly slow. A quiet thief stealing the strongest woman I ever knew. Congenital heart disease does not care about your net worth or your corporate strategy. It just takes and takes until there is nothing left. The hospital room became her new office, even with an oxygen tube taped to her face. She was still reviewing legal briefs and advising me on union negotiations. She fought until her very last breath, fiercely protective of the legacy we had built together. When Evelyn Baldwin died, the silence she left behind was deafening. It was a massive, terrifying void that swallowed the light in our home and the stability in our boardroom. The company lost its brilliant tactical mind. I lost my mentor, my anchor, and my best friend. My father lost his anchor to reality. He stopped smiling. The charismatic, magnetic salesman vanished, replaced by a hollow man who worked 100 hours a week just to avoid going home to an empty house. He threw himself into expanding the company with a reckless, frantic energy. He was trying to outrun his own grief by building the company bigger and faster than ever before. I stepped up to fill the operational void. I took over my mother's old responsibilities while maintaining my own. I worked late into the night, managing the sprawling chaos of our field operations, making sure the gears kept turning while my father secured bigger and bigger contracts. I believed with every fiber of my being that this was our new dynamic. We were two wounded soldiers standing back to back in the trenches, fiercely protecting the empire my mother had sacrificed her life to build. I thought our shared grief would forge an unbreakable bond, a silent promise that we would keep Baldwin Meridian Systems safe, just as she had always wanted. I truly believed we were invincible, bound by sweat, tears, and a shared history that no amount of money could ever replicate. I believed nothing could ever break the fortress we had built around ourselves. That naive belief lasted exactly until the day another woman walked through the front doors of our corporate headquarters, bringing a very different kind of storm with her. Vanessa Hale did not kick the front door down. She did not arrive with loud demands, shattered glass, or obvious hostility. She simply walked into the foyer, smiled a perfectly calibrated smile, and subtly altered the gravitational pull of the entire Baldwin household. Her entry point was a disaster in Rhode Island, We were managing a critical infrastructure upgrade for a massive coastal municipality when a cascading failure in a third-party substation plunged 3 city blocks into darkness for 48 hours. The failure cost us millions in emergency mitigation, but the reputational damage was far worse. The local media was brutal, broadcasting endless images of darkened hospital wings and stranded commuters. The city council was threatening to tear up our contracts and ban us from future bidding. My father was paralyzed by the sudden public relations nightmare, a specialized skill set my mother usually handled with fierce, unapologetic precision. Vanessa was hired as an external crisis communication consultant. She arrived at our staging ground in a slate-gray designer suit, armed with thick binders full of media strategies and a voice that sounded like poured honey over crushed ice. While I was knee-deep in toxic mud, wearing a high-visibility jacket and screaming at substation engineers to bypass the blown electrical circuits, Vanessa was standing safely behind yellow tape, speaking to the news cameras. She looked calm, poised, and deeply reassuring. She promised the city that Baldwin Meridian Systems was profoundly committed to their safety. She spun our operational failure into an inspiring story of corporate resilience and dedication. She never attacked me directly. That was her terrifying genius. A lesser, foolish rival would have pointed out my failures or criticized my rough edges. Vanessa chose to smother me with calculated praise. During the post-crisis debriefing with our executive committee, I sat at the heavy mahogany table with dirt still embedded under my fingernails and the smell of ozone clinging to my jacket. Vanessa stood at the head of the room, looking utterly immaculate. "We are incredibly fortunate to have Serena on our team," Vanessa told the room, directing a warm maternal smile my way. "Her operational focus is absolutely unmatched. She is a relentless force on the ground. But managing a crisis of this magnitude requires a broader public vision. Serena is simply too essential in the trenches, too bogged down in the vital, heavy lifting of the technical mechanics, to be burdened with managing our optics and market perception. We need to protect her from the cameras so she can do what she does best." It sounded exactly like a glowing compliment. It felt exactly like a permanent demotion. In exactly 60 seconds, she had successfully branded me as a brilliant, indispensable mechanic, while simultaneously disqualifying me as a visionary leader. She planted the quiet seed in the minds of the board members that I belonged entirely in the dirt, far away from the spotlight where the real power resided. My father swallowed the poison whole. He was deeply lonely, still hollowed out by my mother's death. Vanessa recognized that gaping void and filled it flawlessly. She did not try to replace my mother's fierce intellect. She offered something entirely different. She offered unwavering, blinding admiration. She polished his fractured ego. She told him he was not just a grieving widower, but a legendary pioneer who deserved to be celebrated by the world. She brought a glossy, sophisticated energy into his life that made him feel powerful, attractive, and alive again. Within 6 months, the crisis consultant became the girlfriend. Within 1 year, she was the new Mrs. Baldwin. Shortly after the lavish wedding, Vanessa gently suggested we needed a fresh perspective on capital allocation to protect his legacy. That was how her son, Nolan Hale, entered the building. Nolan was 31 years old. He came from a boutique hedge fund in New York, bringing a resume full of theoretical financial models and absolutely zero practical experience. Vanessa convinced my father that Nolan was the exact missing piece we needed to prepare for a massive, unprecedented phase of corporate expansion. His official mandate was to modernize our corporate finance structure and prepare us for the future. Nolan possessed a highly dangerous kind of corporate charisma. He knew exactly how to wear a bespoke suit, how to lean confidently against a boardroom podium, and how to speak the hypnotic language of investment bankers. He could charm the grizzled board of directors with beautiful, complex slide decks detailing projected revenue multiples, aggressive margin optimizations, and leveraged debt ratios. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been proven wrong by physical reality. But Nolan did not know anything about the actual blood and sweat of our industry. He had no idea what it meant when a vital shipment of heavy copper wiring was delayed by 3 days. He did not know the sheer, adrenaline-fueled terror of a hospital administrator calling at 2 in the morning because the backup generators were failing during a massive winter freeze. He had never stood in a flooded utility trench. He only saw abstract numbers on a glowing screen. I saw the tangible human cost of a power grid collapse. While Nolan dazzled the executives, Vanessa began building an invisible, impenetrable fortress around my father. She constructed a shadow network of influence. She started hosting intimate, lavish dinners at their new suburban estate, inviting key board members, influential local politicians, and major banking partners. I was rarely invited to these gatherings. When I asked why, Vanessa would offer a highly sympathetic sigh. "Serena, darling, these dinners are just tedious networking," she would say, her hand resting gently and reassuringly on my arm. "We know you are completely exhausted from managing the field operations all week. You need your rest. Leave the boring, tiresome social politics to us. We want you focusing entirely on the real work." I was being systematically boxed out of the rooms where the actual decisions were made, all under the insidious guise of them protecting my valuable time. She quietly encouraged the early retirement of the seasoned executives who had been fiercely loyal to my mother. She replaced them with sleek, agreeable sycophants who cared more about their quarterly stock options than structural engineering integrity. She built a wide moat around my father, and she filled it with people who owed their entire corporate existence to her. Gradually, the language in the executive suites began to shift. My father stopped talking about engineering integrity, storm resilience, and community duty. He started echoing Vanessa's polished, empty vocabulary. "We need to focus heavily on our corporate image," my father announced during a critical quarterly review, reading directly from a memo I knew Vanessa had written for him. "We are entering a crucial repositioning phase. We must transition from a legacy infrastructure builder into a modern, agile energy portfolio. That requires preparing the company for a transitional phase. We need to elevate and empower our next-generation leadership." Next-generation leadership. He was looking right at Nolan when he said it. The realization hit me with a cold, sickening dread that settled deep in my stomach. The most terrifying thing about Vanessa was not that she hated me. If she had been openly hostile, I could have fought back. I could have exposed her malice to the board. But Vanessa was far too smart for open, messy warfare. She did not make the board of directors hate me. She simply manipulated the corporate narrative until pushing me out of the succession plan looked like a completely rational, logical, and necessary business decision. They genuinely believed I was a vital workhorse who simply lacked the refined pedigree to wear the crown. The erosion was so slow, so meticulously calculated, that I did not fully comprehend the mortal danger until it was entirely too late. It culminated on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. We had a highly critical strategy meeting to discuss the potential acquisition of a smaller grid software company. I walked into the main conference room on the top floor. It was the exact room my mother had designed decades ago. I knew the grain of the wood on the massive table. I knew the exact, heavy sound the glass doors made when they clicked shut. But as I stepped inside, the lively conversation instantly died. Nolan was sitting in the high-backed leather chair to my father's immediate right, which had always been my traditional seat. Vanessa was seated at the far end, pouring black coffee for the lead independent director. They all looked up at me. Their expressions were not angry or hostile. They were simply polite. "Ah, Serena," Nolan said, flashing a bright, perfectly empty smile. "We were just running through the preliminary financial models for the acquisition. There is a lot of dense capital structuring jargon on the agenda today. Are you sure you do not need to be down at the staging yard overseeing the new turbine delivery?" I looked directly at my father. He gave me a small, apologetic nod, silently agreeing with Nolan's assessment. I stood there, holding my heavily annotated project files against my chest, surrounded by the massive empire my family had built from a dirty garage. The air in the room felt utterly foreign, filtered and cold. The faces looking back at me were polite, distant, and unified in their gentle, undeniable dismissal. For the very first time in my entire life, I stood in the absolute center of my own company, and I realized I was just a guest. They do not fire you from your own company in a single, dramatic day. That only happens in cheap television shows. In the modern American corporate arena, a hostile takeover from the inside is a slow, methodical starvation. They do not take your badge. They simply stop inviting you to the rooms where your badge matters. They erode your authority with 1,000 tiny, perfectly legal paper cuts. It started with a newly minted title. Nolan Hale was officially named the President of Capital Strategy. It was a completely fabricated role, explicitly designed to place him directly above the senior vice presidents without actually requiring him to manage a single physical asset. He had 0 logged hours on a job site. He had never signed a vendor risk agreement or managed a union dispute, but he now had the authority to dictate our financial trajectory. I felt the first real sting of his new power exactly 3 weeks later. We had our semi-annual review with our largest institutional lender. I had spent 4 solid days compiling the operational efficiency reports to prove our margins were expanding. When I arrived at the executive suite on Tuesday morning, my father's assistant looked at me with genuine confusion. She politely informed me that the meeting had actually taken place the previous afternoon at a private club downtown. I marched directly into my father's office, but Nolan was sitting in the guest chair, casually reviewing a term sheet. My father did not even have the courage to look me in the eye. Nolan did the talking. "Serena," Nolan said, using that aggressively reasonable tone that made my teeth grind. "We did not want to pull you away from the grid optimization project. The lender just needed a high-level overview of our debt restructuring initiative." I represented the Baldwin family. It was purely a capital discussion. He represented the Baldwin family. The sheer audacity of the phrase made my blood run cold. He had hijacked the family name to sell a strategy I had not even seen. I finally saw that strategy the following month, and it was a suicide pact. Nolan proposed spinning off our heavy equipment division and selling 30% of our core infrastructure assets to a massive private equity firm called Black Peer Capital. He called it an asset-light growth model. I called it corporate self-destruction. Those assets were our primary leverage during regional emergencies. Selling them meant we would become middlemen, renting the very equipment we used to own outright. I fought back during the full board meeting. I brought binders of historical data. I showed them exactly how much revenue we would bleed if we had to lease generators during a hurricane season. I argued passionately that we were sacrificing long-term stability for a short-term cash injection to make the balance sheet look pretty for Wall Street. But Vanessa had already done her work. She had spent the last 18 months softening the board, treating them to lavish dinners, flattering their egos, and painting me as a brilliant but rigid traditionalist. When I finished my presentation, the room was terrifyingly silent. The lead independent director, a man my mother had personally recruited, gave me a patronizing smile. "We appreciate your passion for the operational history, Serena," he said, adjusting his expensive glasses. "But the market is shifting. We cannot be chained to heavy iron forever. You are viewing this through the lens of a field mechanic. We need to view this through the lens of global growth. We must avoid obstructing our own evolution." Obstructing growth. They had successfully branded my expertise as a liability. I was no longer the protector of the company. I was the stubborn anchor holding it back. The boardroom defeat was agonizing, but the true fatal blow was delivered in the quiet, sterile language of estate law. 2 weeks before the annual shareholder summit, my father quietly updated the Master Family Trust. It was disguised as a routine tax optimization maneuver. The company legal counsel circulated a summary memo to the executive stakeholders. I read the 5th page of the document 4 times before the words finally registered in my brain. My father had inserted a highly unusual, extremely specific clause regarding the succession of the controlling founder shares. The new language explicitly prioritized the transfer of voting control to, quote, direct blood descendants of the Baldwin lineage, unquote. I sat in my office, completely paralyzed. The words swam on the digital screen. Direct blood descendants, before my mother passed away. She and my father had a unified, unshakable philosophy about the future of Baldwin Meridian systems. They repeatedly stated that the company belonged to the person who bled for it, the person who understood its soul, and the person who would protect its people. Blood type was never a qualification. Grit, loyalty, and competence were the only metrics that mattered. This new legal clause was a complete betrayal of everything we had built. It was a surgical strike designed to introduce a biological purity test into a corporate succession plan. I was still staring blankly at the screen when my office door clicked shut and locked from the inside. Arthur Keene stood there. Arthur was our senior financial controller. He was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 60s who had worked side by side with my mother since the garage days. He possessed a terrifying memory for numbers and an absolute devotion to Evelyn Baldwin's legacy. He looked pale, and his hands were shaking slightly as he pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. I am not supposed to see this, Arthur whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. The family office bypasses my desk for personal expenditures now, but an external billing auditor made a routing error yesterday. They sent a batch of invoices to my department by mistake. He smoothed the paper out on my desk. It was an expense ledger for my father's private accounts, authorized by Vanessa Hale. Look at the payees, Arthur instructed, tapping a trembling finger against the page. There were 2 massive disbursements made over the past 90 days. The first was a payment of $45,000 to a highly specialized private genetic laboratory based in Switzerland. The second was a payment of $120,000 to an elite, discreet investigative firm that specialized in uncovering sealed medical and adoption records. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind, creating a picture so ugly I could barely breathe. There is more, Arthur said, leaning in closer. I called the management company for the off-site secure storage facility in Providence. That is where we keep all the archived corporate documents from before 1998. The physical paper trails. The boxes your mother personally packed and sealed before she got sick. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. What about them? Arthur, Vanessa sent a bonded courier team there last Thursday, he replied, his eyes wide with fear. She used your father's master authorization code. They bypassed the standard logging protocols. They removed 6 specific banker boxes from your mother's restricted section. They loaded them into an unmarked van and drove away. I slowly sat back in my chair. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. This was not a sudden tragedy. This was not a grieving father losing his mind or acting out of a sudden, irrational desire to protect his biological legacy. The courtroom confrontation that was looming on the horizon was not going to be an emotional impulse. It was a meticulously funded, expertly coordinated, multi-layered assassination plot. Vanessa and Nolan had not just charmed their way into the boardroom. They had actively hunted for a weapon powerful enough to destroy me completely. They had dug through decades of buried history, hired genetic mercenaries, and stolen my dead mother's private files to build a biological bomb. They were preparing to use DNA not as a truth, but as a legal crowbar to pry my fingers off the steering wheel of a $5 billion empire. They intended to publicly disown me, strip me of my inheritance, and immediately hand the core of our company over to Black Peer Capital while I was still reeling from the shock. They thought they were dealing with a naive daughter who would simply cry and surrender when faced with a clinical laboratory report. They completely forgot who actually trained me. I looked at the terrified financial controller standing across my desk. Arthur, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. I need you to pull every single transaction between Nolan Hale, Vanessa Hale, and Black Peer Capital for the last 2 years. Every dinner receipt, every flight log, every phone record, They wanted a war over documents and blood. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. The drive down Interstate 95 to Providence took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes, but it felt like a funeral march. Miriam Sloan sat in the passenger seat of my car, silently reviewing the digital files Arthur had provided. Miriam was my personal attorney. She was a brilliant, ruthless corporate litigator who viewed sympathy as a highly inefficient emotion. She did not offer me a shoulder to cry on. She offered me a heavily structured battle plan. Vanessa authorized the removal of 6 specific boxes from the secure storage unit, Miriam said, her eyes fixed on her tablet. But your mother was a legendary archivist. She maintained redundant physical backups for everything. If Vanessa thought she could erase 40 years of history by grabbing a few banker boxes, she severely underestimated Evelyn Baldwin. We arrived at the massive, windowless concrete facility on the edge of the city limits. The air inside the private vault was heavily climate-controlled, smelling of coal dust, dry cardboard, and buried secrets. We unlocked the rusted metal cage that housed the Baldwin corporate history. Vanessa's bonded couriers had indeed left a noticeable gap on the 3rd shelf, but there were still 24 heavy boxes remaining. We spent 3 agonizing hours sitting on the cold concrete floor, sifting through thousands of pages. Touching that old paper felt like reaching across the grave to hold my mother's hand. I found her meticulous handwritten ledgers, early drafts of the family trust, and the original founding share contracts. Her handwriting was sharp, slanted, and completely uncompromising. At the bottom of a mislabeled box dedicated to early vendor tax receipts, I found a thin, faded green folder. Inside was a legal pad filled with my mother's distinct cursive. It was a brainstorming session for the corporate bylaws. Most of it was standard legal terminology. But one sentence was circled 3 times in heavy black ink. We must ensure the legal definition of an heir is secured by intent and shared vision. We must never allow bloodline to be weaponized into a corporate tool. My heart hammered heavily against my ribs. I turned the page. Tucked behind the legal pad was a heavily yellowed invoice. It was not from a copper wire supplier or a municipal utility board. It was from a medical facility that had closed decades ago. The Crescent Reproductive Center. Beneath the invoice was a thick cream-colored envelope bearing the same clinic logo. It was marked as a payment confirmation for an assisted reproduction procedure. I opened it with trembling fingers. But the envelope was incredibly light. The most important pages, the actual medical consent forms and the procedural details, had been ripped out completely. The torn edges of the paper were still visible. Someone had sanitized this file. I handed the empty envelope to Miriam. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. We immediately called Arthur Keene on an encrypted line. Arthur sounded terrified, but his loyalty to my mother overpowered his fear. Vanessa brought those 6 boxes back to the main office last week. Arthur whispered into the phone. She told the executive staff they contained outdated personal documents with no legal value. She ordered the head of building security to have them commercially shredded and incinerated. She watched them destroy the paper herself. A cold wave of despair washed over me, but Arthur took a sharp breath and continued. "But she did not know how your mother filed things," Arthur said, a hint of defiance entering his quiet voice. "Evelyn never sent a box to Providence without creating a master index first. I managed the digital transition 10 years ago, before Vanessa had the paper incinerated. I cross-referenced the barcode on the boxes with our legacy servers. I have the digital scans of the index sheets." Miriam grabbed the phone from my hand. "Arthur, did the index mention the Crescent Reproductive Center?" "Yes," Arthur replied quickly. "It referenced a primary medical storage unit. When Crescent closed down 25 years ago, their patient archives were legally transferred to a centralized medical records depository in North Boston. We left Providence immediately and drove straight back to the city. The medical depository was a massive, sterile building run by a private data management firm. Because I was legally recognized as Malcolm Baldwin's daughter and possessed my mother's death certificate, the archivist granted us access to the historical patient files. They did not have digital copies. The records from that era were preserved entirely on microfilm. We sat in a dark, claustrophobic viewing room. The heavy microfilm machine whirred loudly as Miriam aggressively spun the dial, flashing through thousands of miniature black and white images. We finally found the Baldwin file. Miriam stopped turning the dial. We leaned in close to the glowing screen. The truth was not a complicated mystery. It was written in plain, undeniable medical terminology. When my father was in his early 20s, long before he met my mother or founded the company, he underwent an aggressive medical treatment for a severe illness. The treatment saved his life. But the records clearly stated it left him completely and permanently sterile. He had zero biological capacity to father a child. Miriam slowly advanced the film to the next frame. It was a comprehensive, legally binding donor insemination agreement. My father did not find out about my genetics through a sudden laboratory test. He was not the victim of a wife's infidelity. He was a willing, active participant. The document proved that he and my mother had consciously utilized an anonymous sperm donor. At the bottom of the page, dated exactly 10 months before I was born, was Malcolm Baldwin's signature. He signed his name in bold, black ink, legally consenting to be my father in every recognized sense of the word, fully knowing I would not share his DNA. The betrayal cut through me like a physical blade. He always knew. For 39 years, he looked at me, praised my work, and called me his daughter. And yet, he still allowed Vanessa to drag him into a courtroom and use a completely fabricated story of biological betrayal to steal my life's work. The pain of the lie was agonizing, but the sheer cruelty of his cowardice was suffocating. "Keep reading," Miriam commanded, her voice slicing through the heavy silence in the dark room. She advanced the film one more time. The next document was not a medical form. It was a notarized addendum to the original Baldwin Family Trust, drafted by my mother and legally registered alongside the medical consent forms. Evelyn Baldwin had anticipated the absolute worst parts of human nature. She knew that wealthy families could be torn apart by greedy outsiders looking for a technicality. The addendum was a masterpiece of protective legal drafting. It stated unequivocally that any child born to the marriage via assisted reproduction, provided there was written consent from both spouses, was to be considered a legal, direct heir. Furthermore, it explicitly granted that child full, irrevocable inheritance rights and absolute governance authority over the founding corporate shares. Vanessa and Nolan had found the DNA results. They had found the torn envelope in Providence. They thought they had uncovered a scandalous secret they could use to destroy me. But they did not know about the microfilm, and they fundamentally misunderstood my mother. Evelyn did not hide my origins out of shame. She locked the truth in a legal vault to ensure it could never be used against me. We printed the physical copies of the microfilm. As Miriam gathered the heavy stack of undeniable proof, I carefully packed my mother's original notes back into the faded green folder we had brought from Providence. As I slid her handwritten legal pad into the pocket, my fingers brushed against something thick and stiff, wedged deep into the inner lining of the cardboard folder. It had been completely hidden, glued flat against the seam so that a casual observer flipping through the pages would never notice it. I carefully peeled it away from the cardboard. It was a heavy, pristine white envelope. The flap was sealed shut with dark red wax, stamped with the old, original Baldwin Meridian Systems corporate seal from the garage days. Written across the front of the envelope, in my mother's unmistakable, commanding handwriting, was a single instruction. If one day they use blood to strip your name, open this in court. I stood in the dim light of the medical archive, holding the heavy wax-sealed envelope in my hands. The agonizing sting of my father's betrayal was still burning in my chest, but the fire of my mother's protection was far stronger. She had been dead for years, but she was still fighting for me. She had left me a loaded weapon, perfectly preserved, waiting for the exact moment the enemy broke through the gates. I looked at Miriam. The ruthless litigator gave me a slow, dangerous smile. We had everything we needed. We had the medical proof, we had the legal trust, and we had my mother's final word. We were no longer defending ourselves against a hostile takeover. We were going to walk into that courtroom and burn their entire false narrative to the ground. The independent genetic analysis we had expedited through a secure facility confirmed what the microfilm had already told us. There was zero biological connection between Malcolm Baldwin and me. The markers were completely incompatible. But instead of destroying me, that medical document was the final piece of the puzzle that completely exonerated my mother. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my conception was perfectly aligned with the clinical records of the anonymous donor program. My father did not wake up one morning, take a covert laboratory test, and suddenly discover a terrible, devastating lie. He was never the tragic victim of a wife who had betrayed his trust. He was the man who sat in a sterile doctor's office nearly 4 decades ago, fully aware of his own permanent medical infertility, and consciously signed his name on a legally binding consent form. He agreed to the procedure. He agreed to the trust addendum. He actively chose to become my father. He held me in the hospital nursery, knowing exactly where I came from, and he claimed me as his own. That was the absolute darkest part of the betrayal. I did not collapse in Miriam's office because I lacked his genetic material. Blood is just biology. It does not build empires or sit by hospital beds. I collapsed because I finally understood the sheer magnitude of his cowardice. He had taken a profound truth he once willingly accepted, a choice he made out of love for my mother, and allowed it to be twisted into a public weapon against me. He sat on that witness stand, looked at the judge, and deliberately let the entire world believe my mother was a liar and I was an illegitimate fraud. He sacrificed my mother's flawless reputation and my entire identity just to save himself from the manipulative pressure of his new wife. Miriam Sloane poured 2 glasses of scotch, sliding one across her sleek glass desk toward me. She did not offer empty comfort. She analyzed the battlefield. Vanessa found the results, but she only brought half the story to the courtroom, Miriam said, her voice sharp and calculating. She likely found the medical discrepancy first. Perhaps a stray medical bill or a passing comment from your father's old physician. Then she authorized the secret Swiss genetic test using his funds to confirm it. She built a highly convenient narrative of marital infidelity. She intentionally hid the legal consent forms. Or perhaps she destroyed the physical copies in those storage boxes, completely unaware that your mother's legendary paranoia had secured the microfilm backup. I took a slow sip of the burning liquor. She needed me to be a bastard. If I am an illegitimate child resulting from an affair. The new inheritance clause regarding direct blood descendants easily strips my voting rights. The board of directors would unanimously back my removal to avoid a massive public relations scandal. It is a very clean assassination. Exactly, Miriam agreed, her eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. But if they want to play the rigid game of genetic purity, we are going to force everyone to play by the exact same rules. I filed a legal motion this morning with the probate court. I formally demanded comprehensive, court-supervised genetic profiling for every single individual attempting to lay claim to the Baldwin estate under your father's amended trust. I looked at her, slightly confused. My father already took the test. We know his results. I am not talking about your father, Miriam replied, leaning back in her chair. I am talking about Nolan Hale. Vanessa had spent the last 2 years aggressively maneuvering Nolan into the center of the corporate succession plan, arguing that as my father's legally recognized stepson and the new president of Capital Strategy, he was the natural heir apparent if I was disqualified. I had the court courier serve the mandatory testing notice to Nolan's executive office 3 hours ago. Miriam continued, a cold smile forming on her lips. And his reaction was highly uncharacteristic for a man who believes he has already won the war. He did not pass the notice to his legal team. He called my office directly. He was screaming. He threatened to have me disbarred for harassment. He lost his carefully manufactured composure entirely. He reacted like a man terrified that a simple cheek swab would burn his own house down. That intense overreaction planted a deeply fascinating seed in my mind. But before we could untangle Nolan's panic, the heavy oak door to Miriam's office swung open. Tessa Rowe walked in. Tessa was the forensic financial investigator I had quietly hired on Arthur Keene's recommendation. She was a woman who lived entirely in spreadsheets, offshore tax codes, and encrypted wire transfers. She did not care about our family drama or the emotional weight of a father's rejection. She only cared about where the money moved in the dark. Tessa dropped a thick, heavily bound dossier onto the glass table. "Your financial controller gave me the domestic accounts, but those only showed the small change," Tessa said, not bothering to sit down. "Vanessa Hale is a very smart woman, but she is arrogant. She thought using a third-party corporate shell company would mask her international banking activities. It took me 72 hours of digging through heavily layered shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, but I finally cracked the primary holding account." She flipped the dossier open, revealing rows of highlighted transactional data. Vanessa did not just want to clear the path for her son to become the new chief executive, Tessa explained, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a massive sum. "This is not about family pride or securing Nolan's corporate future. This is a pure, unadulterated liquidation strategy." I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the numbers. There were 3 separate wire transfers, heavily disguised as international consulting retainers, deposited directly into an irrevocable private trust controlled solely by Vanessa Hale. The total sum was exactly $12 million. "Look at the originating entity," Tessa instructed. I traced the routing numbers back to the source column. The originating account belonged to a subsidiary holding firm wholly owned and operated by Black Peer Capital. The entire horrifying picture finally snapped into absolute clarity. Black Peer Capital was the massive private equity firm Nolan had aggressively tried to sell our core infrastructure assets to last quarter. I had blocked the sale in the boardroom, arguing it would destroy our operational leverage during regional emergencies, because I controlled the primary voting shares derived from my mother's founding stake. They could not force the acquisition through as long as I was sitting at the table. Vanessa was not just a greedy stepmother trying to upgrade her lifestyle. She was a highly paid corporate mercenary. Black Peer Capital was secretly funding her. They were paying her millions in offshore bribes to remove our leadership and seize control of the company. The entire dramatic narrative about my lack of Baldwin blood, the courtroom tears, the updated will, and the sudden emphasis on biological legacy was nothing but a convenient, highly emotional smokescreen. They designed the family drama specifically to disguise a ruthless financial objective. They planned to publicly brand me as an illegitimate fraud, humiliating me into stepping away from the company. Once my voting shares were legally neutralized by the new biological clause in my father's will, Nolan would immediately assume control as the undisputed heir. With Nolan in the chairman's seat, he would bypass the board of directors and quietly sign the entire $5 billion corporate empire over to Black Peer Capital for a fraction of its true market value. Black Peer would strip the company for parts, sell our heavy machinery, fire our dedicated engineers, and walk away with billions in profit. My father was too blinded by his own grief and Vanessa's polished manipulation to see that the woman he married was actively selling his life's work to the highest bidder. He was a pawn in his own house. I stared at the offshore bank records. The heavy, suffocating pain of my father's rejection slowly evaporated, entirely replaced by a cold, absolute fury. I had spent the last several months feeling like a victim, agonizing over my place in a family that no longer wanted me. I had questioned my own worth because I did not share the genetic code of the man who raised me. But looking at Tessa's meticulous financial evidence, I realized I had been fighting the wrong war. I was not a rejected daughter trying to win back a father's love. I was the operational commander of Baldwin Meridian Systems, and my company was under a coordinated, hostile siege from parasitic outsiders. I looked up at Miriam and Tessa. My hands were no longer shaking. My vision was perfectly clear. "We are not going to defend my status in that courtroom," I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. We are not going to ask the judge for mercy based on the emotional bond I shared with my father. That is exactly what they expect us to do. I carefully closed the financial dossier and placed it next to the worn green folder containing my mother's wax-sealed envelope and the microfilm printouts. We are going to walk into the final hearing with the genetic evidence, the irrevocable trust addendum, the forensic accounting of the offshore bribes, and proof of their corporate espionage, I told them. I am going to let Eris Thorne and my father build their case in front of the judge and the press, and then I am going to dismantle it piece by piece where everyone can see exactly what they did. I did not waste a single second practicing a tearful victim speech for the judge. Victims beg for justice based on fairness. Strategists build a case so tight, the other side has nowhere to run. I was an engineer. I knew how to design a system that would hold under pressure. Miriam Sloan immediately launched a relentless barrage of targeted subpoenas. She filed expedited motions to compel the production of every single historical draft of the Baldwin family trust. She demanded the raw, unedited metadata for every digital update made to my father's will. Most importantly, she secured a court order demanding the immediate release of all private communications between Vanessa Hale, Nolan Hale, and the executive board of Black Pier Capital. Miriam did not ask the opposing counsel nicely. She weaponized the discovery process, burying Eris Thorne under a mountain of mandatory compliance deadlines. While Miriam handled the legal artillery, Tessa Rowe provided the sniper fire. Tessa took the offshore banking records she had extracted from the Cayman Islands and overlaid them directly onto our internal corporate calendar. The overlap was brutally, undeniably precise. The first offshore deposit of $4 million hit Vanessa's private trust exactly 48 hours after the executive committee quietly circulated a confidential internal memo regarding the potential restructuring of the founding shares. The second, much larger deposit of $8 million cleared the exact same week Nolan was artificially elevated to the position of president of Capital Strategy. Tessa proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that these were not innocent consulting fees or lucky market investments. They were milestone payments for a hostile corporate hijacking. Vanessa was being paid a massive bounty to deliver the company to the private equity firm. I turned my attention to the physical copy of the updated will, the specific document that contained the poisonous clause prioritizing direct blood descendants. I had spent 2 decades reading complex engineering schematics and analyzing material stress tests. I knew how to look for structural anomalies. When I magnified the high-resolution scans of the signature page, something felt fundamentally wrong. The paper stock of the addendum did not match the rest of the binding. The grain was visibly cheaper. The ink used for my father's signature had bled slightly differently into the fibers, strongly suggesting it was signed much later than the preceding pages. More importantly, I looked at the names of the 2 required witnesses. They were not our long-standing corporate attorneys or trusted board members. I ran their names through our employee database. They were private healthcare aides. Arthur Keene pulled one more vital thread. Masaikia. He reached out to a longtime contact at the private wealth management bank where my father kept his most sensitive legacy documents. The vault manager quietly confirmed that Vanessa had requested and gained access to my father's secure safety deposit box exactly 2 years ago. I checked the dates on my personal calendar. It was the exact week my father suffered a minor ischemic stroke. He had been heavily medicated, struggling with his speech, and deeply confused. Vanessa had not just manipulated a grieving widower. She had cornered a legally compromised, medically vulnerable patient in his darkest moment and coerced him into signing away his empire. While they were busy engineering a boardroom coup with forged documents and stolen files, I was still the only person keeping the actual power grid running. On a stormy Thursday night, just 4 days before we were scheduled to return to court, a massive software failure triggered a cascading blackout across a suburban hospital network in upstate New York. It was a code red emergency. Nolan did not answer his phone. Vanessa was attending a lavish charity gala downtown. I sat in our emergency command center from midnight until 6 in the morning, aggressively routing backup generators, overriding failed subroutines, and talking our exhausted field engineers through a dangerous manual grid bypass. I saved the company from a massive negligence lawsuit and kept the critical care units powered while the people trying to steal my title were sleeping comfortably in their mansions. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof that a biological name does not keep the lights on. Work does. The next afternoon, my personal phone rang. It was a private number. My father asked me to meet him at a discreet, dimly lit steakhouse on the edge of the financial district. I walked into the private dining room. He looked terrible. He was exhausted, and his expensive tailored suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He did not look like a corporate titan anymore. He did not offer an apology. Instead, he slid a heavy, folded piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was a private settlement offer. He offered me $50 million in unmarked corporate bonds, completely tax-free and immediately liquid. The only condition was that I had to drop my legal challenge, walk away from Baldwin Meridian Systems forever, and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding the fertility clinic records. "Take the money, Serena," my father whispered, staring down at his untouched glass of scotch. "Start your own firm. Build something new. Let this go before it gets entirely too ugly in the press. We do not need to drag the family name through the mud." I sat perfectly still, staring at the man who had taught me how to read a voltmeter when I was a child. For months, I had held on to a tiny, desperate, pathetic hope that he was just a confused, heartbroken old man who had been thoroughly brainwashed by a manipulative woman. I wanted to believe he was a victim of Vanessa's poison, but looking at the $50 million bribe, that final illusion shattered into dust. He was not protecting me. He was not protecting the company. He was entirely protecting his own fragile, massive ego. He was absolutely terrified of his wealthy peers, his board members, and the ruthless business press finding out he was medically sterile. He was perfectly willing to pay $50 million to keep his masculine facade intact, even if it meant sacrificing his loyal daughter and destroying his late wife's legacy. The realization froze the blood in my veins. "Keep your money, Malcolm," I said softly, standing up from the table. "I am keeping my mother's company." I walked out without looking back. Back at the legal office, Miriam finalized the masterstroke of our trap. She quietly filed an ex parte motion with the judge to formally admit Nolan Hale's expanded DNA test into the official court record. Miriam argued with absolute, lethal logic, since the opposing counsel had explicitly introduced biological lineage as the sole determining factor for corporate inheritance. The court had a strict legal obligation to verify the genetic standing of all potential beneficiaries seeking to inherit. The judge, clearly annoyed by Eris Thorne's earlier theatrical stunts with my genetics, granted the motion under seal. We had the match, the fuel, and the locked doors. On the morning of the second hearing, I did not feel the crushing, suffocating anxiety that had paralyzed me during the first session. I walked up the massive marble steps of the courthouse feeling terrifyingly calm. The heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4 loomed ahead. Inside, Eris Thorne, Vanessa, Nolan, and my father were already sitting at the plaintiff's table, polishing their lies and preparing their final arguments. They genuinely thought they were waiting for a broken, illegitimate woman to walk in and finally surrender the keys to the kingdom. They had absolutely no idea that I was no longer searching for the truth. I was bringing the truth to expose them. The heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4 clicked shut, sealing the humid air inside. Eris Thorne stood at the plaintiff's podium, radiating the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won a $5 billion lottery. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and addressed the judge with a theatrical sigh of feigned regret. "Your Honor," Thorne began, projecting his voice so the gallery reporters could catch every syllable. "We have submitted the final, court-supervised genetic analysis. The science is absolute. Malcolm Baldwin shares 0% of his genetic material with the respondent. Serena Baldwin is a biological stranger. Under the explicit, legally binding terms of the amended family trust, which prioritizes direct blood descendants. We formally request the immediate revocation of her inheritance rights and the immediate transfer of all controlling corporate shares back to the legal patriarch." Thorne smiled warmly at my father, who sat staring at his own hands, unable to meet my gaze. Vanessa Hale sat perfectly still, her face a mask of dignified sorrow. Nolan Hale smirked. I did not wait for my lawyer or the judge. I pushed my chair back and stood. The heavy legs of the chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. Cutting through Thorne's grand conclusion, every head in the room snapped toward me. The reporters leaned forward. "That genetic result is entirely real," I said. My voice was completely steady, carrying across the silent room without a microphone. "But the story you are telling from it is entirely fake." Thorne blinked, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Your Honor, the respondent is making outbursts." "The respondent has the floor," the judge snapped, leaning forward over the bench. Her eyes locked intensely on me. "Proceed, Miss Baldwin." Miriam Sloane stood up beside me, opening a thick leather binder. She did not bring a single piece of standard printer paper. She brought large, high-resolution photographic prints mounted on heavy display boards. "Your Honor," Miriam stated, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "The plaintiff has constructed a compelling narrative of marital infidelity and biological betrayal. It is a highly emotional story. It is also a complete fabrication. We submit into evidence Exhibit B, officially certified microfilm records retrieved from the primary medical depository of the defunct Crescent Reproductive Center." Miriam placed the first board on the easel facing the bench. It was the medical evaluation from nearly 4 decades ago. This document confirms that Malcolm Baldwin was diagnosed with permanent, irreversible medical sterility in his early 20s. Miriam continued, letting the words hang in the air. A collective gasp ripped through the gallery. The flashbulbs of the press cameras reflected off the courtroom windows. I looked at my father, his face drained of all color. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. The one secret he had offered me $50 million to hide was now part of the permanent public record. He was never deceived by his late wife, Miriam said loudly, overpowering the murmuring crowd. She placed the second board on the easel. "This is a legally binding donor insemination agreement, dated 10 months before my client was born. At the bottom is the unmistakable, notarized signature of Malcolm Baldwin. He consciously and actively participated in the assisted reproduction process. He legally consented to assume the role of father, fully knowing the child would never share his genetic code." Thorne stared at the boards, completely paralyzed. He looked back at Vanessa, whose perfectly composed mask was finally beginning to crack. Her eyes darted frantically toward the exit doors. She had hired private investigators and secret laboratories, but she had never checked the medical archives. "Furthermore," I said, stepping out from behind the defense table, "my mother, Evelyn Baldwin, was the primary legal architect of our corporate foundation. She anticipated that greed might one day attempt to exploit biology." Miriam displayed the third board. "It was the original founding trust addendum. This is the governing charter of Baldwin Meridian Systems," Miriam declared. "It explicitly states that any child born via assisted reproduction with the written consent of both spouses possesses absolute, irrevocable inheritance and governance rights, equal in every legal measure to a biological descendant. This foundational trust supersedes any recent, manipulated amendments to a personal will." Vanessa shot up from her chair, her manicured hands slamming onto the table. "Those are ancient, irrelevant documents. We have no idea where they came from. They could easily be forged. The family never kept these records in the official corporate vault." "You are absolutely right, Mrs. Hale," Miriam replied, flashing a predatory smile. "The family did keep them, but you ordered your bonded couriers to steal 6 specific archival boxes from our secure storage facility in Providence last month. You then illegally ordered our building security chief to incinerate them, believing you were burning the only copies of the medical consent forms to clear the path for your son." Vanessa froze. Nolan's jaw dropped. Fortunately, Miriam added, pulling a stack of digital printouts from her binder, Evelyn Baldwin maintained a master digital index, and the medical depository maintained the microfilm. We have the digital chain of custody, the server timestamps, and the sworn affidavit of our financial controller confirming your direct order to destroy corporate evidence. The judge slammed her wooden gavel down hard, silencing the erupting chaos in the gallery. She pointed a sharp finger directly at Eris Thorne. "Counselor," the judge warned, her tone dangerously low, "did your clients deliberately conceal prior medical consent forms and destroy relevant historical trust documents before filing this petition to disinherit the respondent?" Thorne looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. "Your Honor, we were entirely unaware of these specific medical records. My clients acted on the genetic discrepancy. They acted on a calculated business strategy," I interjected, looking directly at the judge. "For the past 15 years, I have lived in the operational trenches of Baldwin Meridian Systems. I restructured our supply chains, I managed the union contracts, and I personally directed the emergency grid protocols that generated our record profit margins. I built the tangible value of the shares they are trying to steal." Meanwhile, Nolan Hale was artificially elevated to president of Capital Strategy purely through his mother's marital influence, without managing a single physical asset or working a single day in the field. I turned to look at Nolan. He shrank back into his chair under the weight of the entire courtroom's scrutiny. "They did not bring this lawsuit to correct a biological wrong," I stated clearly. "They brought this lawsuit to execute a hostile corporate takeover. They used my DNA as a smokescreen to systematically strip the operational founder of her voting rights, ensuring they could seize complete control of the board." The heavy atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The narrative was no longer about a tragic father discovering a painful family secret. The judge was no longer looking at me as a potential fraud. She was glaring at Vanessa and Nolan like they were corporate criminals caught in the act of a massive fraud. The fundamental question of the trial had instantly transformed from biological legitimacy to malicious corporate espionage. Thorne frantically whispered to his co-counsel, desperately trying to formulate a defense against the destruction of evidence charge. My father buried his face in his hands, completely broken by the public exposure of his deepest shame and his profound cowardice. I stood tall at the defense table, my hand resting gently against the worn leather of my old briefcase. We had just dismantled their entire legal foundation in less than 20 minutes. The courtroom was buzzing with the electric shock of the revelation. But I was not finished. The microfilm only proved my legitimacy. It did not punish them for their greed. The offshore banking records detailing Vanessa's massive bribes from Black Pier Capital were still hidden in Tessa Rowe's dossier. Nolan's mandatory genetic test results were still sealed in Miriam's briefcase. And deep inside my jacket pocket, heavy and warm against my chest, was the thick envelope sealed with red wax, bearing my dead mother's final command. I let the suffocating silence stretch out, allowing Vanessa and Nolan to feel the icy terror of knowing their carefully constructed world was collapsing. I let them believe the worst was over. I let the entire room settle into the false comfort that the climax of the trial had just passed. They had absolutely no idea how much darker the room was about to get. Miriam Sloane did not pause to let the opposing counsel catch their breath. She did not give them a single moment to recover from the devastating revelation of the destroyed medical archives. She smoothly turned the page of her heavy leather binder, her eyes locked entirely on the judge. The defense was officially over. The execution had begun. "Your Honor," Miriam stated, her voice ringing with absolute, chilling authority. "Yesterday afternoon, you granted our ex parte motion requiring mandatory, court-supervised genetic profiling for all individuals seeking to inherit corporate control under the plaintiff's newly amended trust. Since the opposing counsel explicitly demanded that biological lineage must be the sole determining factor for the transfer of the $5 billion estate, we requested that the court hold every single person in this room to that exact same standard." Miriam pulled a sealed, stamped laboratory document from her binder. She held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "I hold the certified, expedited genetic report for Nolan Hale," Miriam announced. Nolan stiffened in his chair. The arrogant, relaxed posture he had maintained since the beginning of the trial vanished instantly. He sat bolt upright, his face draining of color. "The scientific results are absolute," Miriam read aloud, her voice echoing off the high mahogany walls. "Nolan Hale shares exactly 0% of his genetic material with Malcolm Baldwin. He possesses absolutely no biological connection to the Baldwin family bloodline." Vanessa Hale sprang to her feet, her chair crashing backward onto the marble floor, her perfectly composed facade shattered into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "That is entirely irrelevant," Vanessa shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate, completely abandoning her polished socialite persona. "He is my son. He is Malcolm's legally recognized stepson. You cannot bring his genetics into this. It is entirely relevant because you made it the only rule of engagement," Miriam fired back, stepping away from the podium and advancing toward the center of the room. "You coerced a medically vulnerable man into signing a forged will that explicitly demands direct blood descendants. You weaponized a biological purity test to strip a 39-year operational founder of her life's work. Yet, your own son fails the exact same genetic test. You use the sacred concept of bloodline to create a legal vacuum, knowing perfectly well that neither you nor your son possess a single drop of Baldwin blood." A chaotic, deafening wave of whispers erupted from the gallery, but the most profound reaction did not come from the press or the judge. It came from Nolan. He slowly turned his head and stared at his mother. His eyes were wide with a horrifying realization, for the very first time in his life. He was looking at Vanessa not as a brilliant strategist, but as a treacherous liability. He finally realized that the impossibly narrow legal trap she had built to destroy me was now officially choking him. "But the hypocrisy of the bloodline argument is only the surface of the fraud," Miriam continued, raising her voice over the chaotic murmurs of the courtroom. She turned to the heavy dossier compiled by our forensic accountant. "We submit Exhibit C into the official record. This is a comprehensive forensic audit tracing highly classified financial transactions and internal corporate communications." Miriam opened the dossier and began reading with lethal precision. "Between the 4th of May and the 12th of August, exactly $12 million was wired through 3 separate offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. These funds were deposited directly into a private, irrevocable offshore trust. The originating entity for every single dollar was Black Pier Capital, the exact private equity firm that has been aggressively attempting to acquire the founding shares of Baldwin Meridian Systems." Thorne, the opposing litigator, looked like he was about to faint. He had clearly been kept entirely in the dark regarding the offshore bribes. He stepped away from his own clients, physically distancing himself from the toxic fallout. "Let us examine the corporate communications," Miriam said, pulling a stack of printed emails from the folder. "On Tuesday, the 14th of October at 9 in the morning, Nolan Hale sent a heavily encrypted email from his private server to the executive board of Black Pier Capital. I quote directly from the text. We must aggressively label the daughter as an illegitimate fraud. Once her voting shares are legally neutralized by the new biological clause, she will be socially and legally isolated. We will then force a mandatory buyout of her equity at 20 cents on the dollar. Following her immediate removal, I will secure the board's approval to transfer the founding stake to Black Pier Capital in a closed-door transaction." End quote. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. Nolan Hale orchestrated the corporate handover, Miriam concluded, delivering the final, fatal blow. But here is the most fascinating detail of the financial audit. The offshore trust containing the $12 million bribe from Black Pier Capital is listed under the sole exclusive ownership of Vanessa Hale. Nolan's name does not appear anywhere on the banking registry. Nolan gasped audibly. He looked at his mother with absolute disgust and raw terror. He realized she had not just sold my company, she had secured the bribe entirely for herself. Leaving him to take the legal and professional fall as the fraudulent heir, the thieves were turning on each other right in front of the judge. The judge slammed her gavel down with terrifying force. The sharp crack sounded like a gunshot. Her face was dark with unprecedented judicial fury. She bypassed the lawyers entirely and pointed her gavel directly at the witness stand, where my father sat, broken and trembling. "Mr. Baldwin," the judge commanded, her voice vibrating with cold rage, "you will answer this court immediately, and you will answer truthfully, or I will have you remanded into federal custody for perjury before the hour is over." "Did you have prior knowledge of the donor insemination before this trial began? Did you sign those medical consent forms?" My father slowly lifted his head. He looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. His expensive suit looked ridiculously large on his slumped shoulders. He looked at the gallery. He looked at Vanessa. And finally, he looked at me. His eyes were filled with tears, but I felt absolutely no pity for him. "Yes," my father whispered. His voice was so weak the court reporter had to lean forward to hear him. "Yes, I knew." "Speak clearly into the record. Mr. Baldwin," the judge ordered fiercely. "I knew," my father said, his voice cracking. "I knew before she was born. I consented to the procedure, but after my stroke 2 years ago, I was so weak. I was terrified." Vanessa found the old medical bills. She told me the board of directors would lose faith in my legacy if they found out I was sterile. She told me the press would humiliate me. She said if we just updated the will with the bloodline clause, we could quietly push Serena out of the voting seat without ever revealing my medical history to the public. She promised me it would be clean. I was ashamed. I just wanted to protect my image. He buried his face in his trembling hands, openly weeping. He had traded his loyal daughter, his late wife's brilliant legacy, and his entire corporate empire just to hide his own bruised ego. The judge stared at him with profound disgust. She leaned back in her heavy leather chair and addressed the entire room. "This court has presided over many bitter, emotionally devastating family disputes," the judge stated, her words dropping like heavy anvils. "But I have rarely seen such a calculated, malicious deployment of fraudulent corporate governance. This is not a misunderstanding. This bears all the undeniable markers of deliberate documentary concealment. A gross, bad faith abuse of the inheritance process, and a highly coordinated financial conspiracy designed to defraud a primary shareholder." The judge shifted her intense gaze away from the wreckage of the plaintiff's table and looked directly at me. The anger in her eyes faded, replaced by a look of deep, profound respect. "Miss Baldwin," the judge said softly, "it is abundantly clear to this court that your late mother, Evelyn Baldwin, was a visionary architect. She built an ironclad foundation to protect you. But given the staggering, unprecedented depths of this conspiracy, I must ask, is there any final definitive document? Did Evelyn Baldwin leave any specific instruction indicating she anticipated her own husband might one day allow biology to be weaponized against her company?" I stood up. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I did not look at my father. I did not look at the woman who had tried to destroy me. I reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the heavy, pristine paper. I slowly pulled out the cream-colored envelope, the dark red wax seal, stamped with the original garage-era logo of Baldwin Meridian Systems, caught the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing with the strength of the woman who had raised me. "My mother knew that an empire built on steel could only be protected by iron. She left exactly one thing for this exact moment." I held the thick envelope up in the air. The dark red wax cracked sharply under my thumb, the sound echoing loudly in the absolute, suffocating silence of courtroom number 4. I reached inside and pulled out 2 distinct pieces of paper. One was a stiff, heavily embossed legal document bearing the raised seal of a notary public from over 3 decades ago. The other was a simple piece of personal stationery, filled edge to edge with my mother's sharp, slanted handwriting. I did not hand the handwritten letter to Miriam Sloane. This was not merely a piece of legal evidence for my attorney to submit into the corporate record. This was a direct message from a mother to her daughter. And I was going to read it myself. "Your Honor," I said, my voice completely steady and carrying effortlessly across the large room. "This is a letter from Evelyn Baldwin, the co-founder and original legal architect of this enterprise. She wrote this, knowing a day might eventually come when the massive empire we built would be threatened by the very people supposed to protect it." I looked down at the familiar blue ink. Taking a deep breath, I read her words aloud. "My dearest Serena," I read, "if you are opening this seal, it means the absolute worst parts of human nature have finally found their way into our home. If one day Malcolm, or a new spouse, or a greedy board of directors attempts to use your genetics to strip you of your rightful name and your place in our company, I want you to know that I saw them coming." I paused, letting the devastating weight of Evelyn's foresight settle over the opposing table. Vanessa Hale was gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so hard her knuckles were completely white. "I have legally ensured that blood can never be used as a weapon against you," I continued reading. "Effective immediately upon any formal legal challenge to your biological legitimacy. My entire block of founding shares, and 100% of their associated executive voting rights, automatically and irrevocably transfer directly to you, Serena. This transfer instantly voids any prior or subsequent attempts to shift corporate control to a second spouse, a stepchild, or any outside financial institution." I looked up from the stationery and stared directly into Nolan Hale's terrified eyes. "She added a final, specific note," I told the silent courtroom. She wrote, "We built this business with our bare hands. It survives only if it is fiercely protected by hands that understand the heavy machinery and the actual human lives that depend on our power grids. It does not belong to people who treat our family legacy like a cheap commodity to be traded in the dark." Miriam stepped forward instantly, taking the second, heavily embossed paper from my hand and presenting it directly to the judge. "Your Honor," Miriam stated, her tone ringing with absolute lethal victory, "this is the original, fully executed appendix to the Baldwin Founding Trust. It was drafted by Evelyn Baldwin and properly notarized long before her passing. In corporate law, a foundational, irrevocable trust charter maintains absolute, unquestionable supremacy over any subsequent amendments made to a personal will. Malcolm Baldwin's recent attempt to insert a biological purity clause into his personal estate planning is completely legally void regarding the corporate shares. He never possessed the unilateral legal authority to overwrite Evelyn's founding trust." Vanessa collapsed back into her chair. Her perfectly composed, polished socialite mask melted away entirely, leaving behind the hollow face of a completely ruined woman. All her lavish networking dinners, the $12 million in offshore bribes, the stolen archival boxes, and the secret Swiss genetic tests were instantly rendered completely useless. She had spent 2 years aggressively trying to pick a legal lock that Evelyn Baldwin had permanently welded shut decades ago. The judge did not even need to call a recess to consider the new evidence. The deep anger on her face had crystallized into cold, absolute judicial certainty. "The court officially recognizes the supremacy of the Founding Trust Appendix," the judge declared, her voice booming with undeniable finality. "The plaintiff's petition to disinherit the respondent is hereby denied and dismissed with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, the court formally recognizes Serena Baldwin as the sole, legitimate controlling shareholder of the central founding stake of Baldwin Meridian Systems." The judge then turned her furious gaze toward the plaintiff's table, pointing her wooden gavel directly at Vanessa and Nolan. "Given the staggering, undeniable evidence of corporate espionage and financial fraud presented by the defense today, this court hereby orders the immediate freezing of all assets, private bank accounts, and corporate share transfers related to Vanessa Hale, Nolan Hale, and any entities associated with Black Peer Capital." I am officially ordering a full federal forensic review of your financial activities. Nobody at that table is permitted to leave the jurisdiction." Nolan buried his face in his hands, realizing he was going to take the fall for a massive federal fraud, while his mother's offshore accounts were locked by the government. There was only one loose end left. The judge looked down at the broken man sitting in the witness stand. "Mr. Baldwin," the judge asked coldly, "do you have anything you wish to put on the public record before I close these proceedings?" My father slowly stood up. He looked entirely hollowed out, a ghost of the legendary Titan he used to be. The press cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing the absolute ruin of his carefully curated image. He had no leverage left, no fortune to hide behind, and nothing to shield him from the terrible, unforgivable choice he had made. He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with desperate tears. "I formally retract my statement," my father said, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Serena is my daughter. I willingly chose to be her father before she took her first breath. I am the one who failed her." I did not smile, and I did not offer forgiveness. Some betrayals cut too deep for that. But I did not need to humiliate him either. Real power does not need a spectacle. I simply gathered my files and placed them carefully back into my mother's old leather briefcase. I did not seek a fiery, chaotic revenge that would ruin the lives of innocent employees. I simply enforced the reality of my new authority with cold precision. Within 24 hours, I officially stripped Vanessa of all security access to the corporate properties and the executive board. I suspended Nolan Hale from his fabricated management position indefinitely, leaving him isolated and entirely alone to face the federal fraud investigators. I immediately blocked the Black Pier Capital acquisition, saving the careers of thousands of loyal engineers and field workers. I simply secured the fortress and let the brutal truth do the rest of the work. A week later, I walked onto the top floor of the Baldwin Meridian Systems headquarters. I did not go to my old, cramped operational office down the hall. Instead, I headed straight into the main glass-walled boardroom. The massive room was silent. I crossed to the heavy mahogany table and pulled out the large leather chair at its head, the official seat of the new corporate chairman. I sat down. The leather was cool, firm, and familiar. I looked out the massive windows at the sprawling city electrical grid we had built, repaired, and maintained for decades. I took a deep, grounding breath, feeling the phantom weight of my mother's hand on my shoulder. I finally understood the truth. I did not win this massive war because I shared a specific sequence of DNA with a powerful man. I won because my mother was a brilliant visionary. She looked deep into the future, saw the exact day greedy people would try to weaponize the concept of blood against me, and she reached across time to hand me both the unbreakable law and the absolute courage to end their game right at the final minute. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening to this story from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and please support us even more by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.